that we started with Longmont for Palestine, an education series about the history of Palestine and the conflict that's going on, or has been going on for the last 70 years plus. Initially, we had 3 series about the history, and we wanted to have a Jewish perspective on the conflict, a Jewish perspective that is not Zionist, or more specifically, anti-Zionist. Because there is a conflation that is going on between Judaism and Zionism, which are 2 different things. And so we want to make sure that the voices, Jewish voices who are opposed to Zionism, are heard also. So we're very happy to have JVP, Jewish Voice for Peace, with us today. And I will introduce Alex. Alex Bornstein, they are an organizer for the Denver Classroom Teacher Association and is a member of JVP, which is actually the largest Jewish anti-Zionist organization in the country with more than 400 members in Colorado. And then Asa, also a JVP member and organizer for the Orarian campaign last year. And then, of course, Dr. Rob Prince, who's a retired professor of global political economy at DU, at the Corbell School. Yep. And more importantly, also, he's well known because he was a political commentator on Middle East dialogue at KGNU for 13 years. So please welcome them, and we're looking forward to having this discussion with them. And before we start, I just wanted to mention that the merchandise outdoors, these are merchandise, the proceeds of which go 100% to support families in Gaza. We do not keep a dime here. All the material, everything is donated and produced by our members. We are afraid that we're going to lose contact with those families because of the ongoing bombing of Gaza. So please, if you can help, do so at the end. So with that, I'll turn it over to JVP.
Okay, let's see. Is this on now? No. How about like that? Yeah, I guess now it's on. So hello, everybody. It's so nice to be here. Frankly, among a bunch of old friends that Arif Yukari in particular, that I've known for a long time. I just want to explain to you how we're going to do this real briefly, because there's 3 of us. And the way we're going to do it is kind of like a conversation. And since I'm, as they say in Yiddish, the older kaka, okay, which just kind of means old fart. Kind of, even that's cleaned up a little bit. But having said that, we thought it would be better to do it as a conversation rather than three lectures. So I've got a series of questions that I'm going to ask my friends here, and we'll discuss it. It's pretty informal. We really want time to open it up, all right? We don't want to just talk at you. So I'm just telling you that we'll do what we can. One last thing I just wanted to share. I don't know, must have been about 3 years ago, I get a notice. So I live in Denver. And there's going to be an anti-Zionist Yom Kippur, the Jewish holiday in Denver. I said, wait a second, what could that be? You know, I had never heard of anything quite like that. And as much for curiosity as anything else, and being essentially a pretty secular person. I haven't been to Yom Kippur for quite a while. So I went, and it was in someone's backyard in southeast Denver, and I was stunned. First of all, there were a lot of people there. That was already a surprise. I don't remember the number, but it seemed to me 40 or 50. And other than one guy who was a fellow in Solidarity Alta Kaka, everybody in that room was under the age of 40. And they're wearing, then, free Gaza t-shirts. So free Gaza t-shirts at a Yom Kippur service. Okay, that's all I needed to see. I was hooked. I wanted to be part of this. All right, anyhow, what's come out of that is, there's really been nothing, at least in my lifetime, like Jewish Voice for Peace. National organization, clearly anti-Zionist, in a very good sense of the term. And I did want to just say one more thing about it, because my generation, so I just turned 80, all right? We're tended to be, those of us Jews that took this position, we tend to be secular. Secular, left, Marxist, whatever. The new generation, they're far more religious than we used to be. They know Judaism. I mean, that Yom Kippur service, I used to know a Yom Kippur service by heart, okay? But that's a while ago. But I do know if you like how a good Yom Kippur service works. I want to tell you, these folks know their Judaism. So I just wanted to kind of give you that background before starting. So having said that, let us start with this question. Introduce yourselves a little bit, okay? Why don't you start?
Hi, my name is Asa. As was mentioned in my introduction, I'm a member of Jewish Voice for Peace, and I was an organizer and lead negotiator of the Harari encampment for Palestine. And I actually hadn't joined JVP up until that point. I met everyone in Denver Boulder JVP because as soon as we put up our encampment, they were all there to help. And I was pretty much hooked ever since. Part of my reasons for getting into this work are I'm of Sephardi and Ashkenazi descent. My family on my Sephardi side comes from the island of Salonika in Greece. This was an old socialist stronghold. It was mostly wiped out during the Holocaust. And on my Ashkenazi side, my family was from Vilna, Lithuania. Vilna is the birthplace of the Jewish Labor Bund. This was a socialist group that came up with the phrase Doikheit, which is kind of seen as the antithesis of Zionism. It means here-ness, as opposed to any sort of there-ness. And so I'm sure we can get into more of that later, but that's a little bit of why I do what I do here.
I've been to the Jewish community in Salonika, or what was, and just felt the ghosts of the people that used to be there that all went to Auschwitz and were wiped out. Okay, Alex.
All right, hello. It's so wonderful to see so many people here. I guess before I start, I do want to, just acknowledge the horrendous genocide in Gaza that's claimed the lives of almost more than 300,000 people. It's almost impossible to really know what the actual count is. And so their hearts they're always on my heart and always on my mind in everything and anything that I do. And so I'm Alex. I am a labor organizer with the Teachers Union, which means that I call HR partners fuck asses a lot, like I was on Friday. I'll try not to cuss as much. That's just, I'm a labor organizer, so that'll happen a lot. And yeah, I guess kind of my background with JVP, I've been a member of JVP since 2018. I also have family who was from Salonika and Crete on my mother's side, and then on my dad's side, his parents are both Polish Jews who their entire families were wiped out during the Holocaust. I'm actually named after my grandmother's younger brother, and so, even though the Holocaust Museum in LA thinks that never again only applies to Jewish people with their recent statement that they put up and then took down because of tremendous pressure. We'll get a little bit more into that, I'm sure, but an absolute shame. But I do this work because, you know, even if I wasn't Jewish, this would be a horrendous thing that's happening. But I think especially because I'm Jewish, and especially because I'm the grandchild of Holocaust survivors, that this work is incredibly important, and the intersection of so many different lanes into each other and so many different struggles, they are all coming through in Palestine. And so, you know, we'll talk a little bit more about how Palestine and Gaza is the litmus test for your humanity, I'm sure. And so, you know, yeah, I think what's happening is horrible, and I think that Zionism has, you know, crushed the soul of Judaism writ large in the United States. And, you know, a group like JVP, we exist to reclaim that.
Right. Okay, well, there's a lot of organizations that you both could have joined to express your solidarity with the Palestinians and your critique of what Israel is doing in Gaza and the West Bank. Why did you choose Jewish Voice for Peace?
I'd known about JVP for a long time, specifically in them kind of being both a figurehead and also a disseminator of information for all of us anti-Zionist Jews who are rarely represented in mainstream Jewish communities. And that is not to say that we don't exist, you know. Again, like my own family has been opposed to the idea of Zionism for longer than the state of Israel has existed. My grandmother had a tapestry in her home that said, "My home is where I live," kind of a tongue-in-cheek sort of thing, saying my home is not over there. And when I was living in New York as a kid, she took me to a Jews for Racial and Economic Justice march during Operation Protective Edge, which was in 2014. This is a war in Gaza, one of the last escalations against it. And even in New York City, the numbers, they were big, but they were not that big. And I think that was a moment, I was 14 years old at the time, that I sort of had my heart break open in terms of seeing this in a lot of ways as the moral struggle that epitomizes so many of the other moral struggles we're facing in our times. And so I chose to join JVP because the vocabulary and the language that I would use in any anti-war movement would be this language of catastrophe that I am able to access through my Jewishness and through the deep sort of dark intertwining of faiths that I feel with the Palestinian people, knowing what they've endured since the Nakba. But JVP, I think, is really resurrecting that momentum and that focus of the anti-war left, not just for Jewish people, but just for everybody, of bringing a combination of, you know, direct action sort of tactics, actually speaking truth to power in the halls of power, and also recognizing that winning means getting our hands dirty and working with institutions, that it means basically capturing these sorts of three pillars, as we call it. JVP sort of understands that the basis of this partnership between America and Israel, which is the only thing that can keep Israel going. Israel itself has said that their current war in Gaza could only continue for 3 days without U.S. military support. And what bolsters this partnership is a political relationship in which it is advantageous to U.S. foreign policy interests. It is a cultural relationship, a tie between the forces of Christian Zionism and Orientalism in the Middle East, and it is a financial partnership through tech companies and military contractors. And I think JVP's analysis is the most lucid there. There also aren't a lot of protests I can lead prayers at, so I like doing both.
Okay.
Yeah, so I guess kind of how I fell into JVP, I was not blessed like Asa with a family who was generations of anti-Zionists. My family, to this day, are still fairly staunch Zionists. It was only, last week that my mom, who's a very liberal Zionist type person, said, "What's happening in Gaza is bad. They should stop that." And I said, "Yeah, you know, you can do something about that. And she said, well, there's plenty of Arab countries that can help out with that. And I was like, oh, well, you know, Yemen and Iran and Hezbollah are helping with that, which I'm sure she would not like that answer. But, you know, my kind of background, I grew up in a liberal progressive synagogue. I had been to occupied Palestine several times, and I was in Hebrew school all throughout my life, and the entire message the entire time while I was in those institutions was, Israel's great, it is the only democracy in the Middle East, it is the only place where you can be a queer person in the Middle East, it's the only place where there are different ethnicities and groups of people that are respected and honored, and, you know, all the BS that they, you know, channel through, which is really disappointing because, you know, my synagogue growing up, I thought was kind of this place where I learned progressivism and, you know, standing up for people and doing the right thing, even when it's hard. And it wasn't until I was in a college-level Jewish history class that I actually learned about the Nakba. This is like learning about, you know, thinking you're an expert in US history without learning about the institutions of racialized slavery or learning about the genocide of indigenous people. We just kind of learned it was a war and there was 6 countries against us and we miraculously beat them. What they failed to mention is that we were heavily armed by the British and French governments. And that's just something that is completely left out of the equation. And so that was a huge wake-up call to me. After that, I had done a little more research, been in more classes, and by the time I graduated, I had a political science degree, and I said, I don't know what the hell I'm gonna do. How about I go on Birthright and study in yeshiva in Jerusalem? So I went on Birthright, and it is even more propagandized than you could ever imagine. And after Birthright, I had stayed in Jerusalem to study in an Orthodox yeshiva, which was very interesting because when you're living in Jerusalem and you're not on one of these super catered trips where they take you where they want to take you, you can go where you want to go, for the most part. And so I had gone from essentially the Jewish neighborhood that I was in called Nachlaot and went to East Jerusalem where the Palestinians are. Jerusalem is one of the most segregated cities in the world. And when I was there, I saw so many people begging on the streets. I saw in Israel, they have soldiers, everyone has to join the army, but when you go into the Palestinian neighborhood, you see cops, which is not something that you see around Jerusalem proper. You see police officers. So these are people who have already been in the military. We thought, I want to crack some skulls and continue doing this. And, you know, when I was there, the Palestinians treated me like a human because they're also human. Crazy idea, I know. I came back to my yeshiva and said, oh, I was in the Palestinian market. Their dates are half the price that they are in the Jewish market. Everyone there is wonderful. And some of my yeshiva classmates who were, for the most part, American white Jews said, oh my gosh, are you okay? Did anyone try and attack you or stab you or, you know, get at you for being Jewish because I was wearing a yarmulke and, you know, I looked like an Orthodox Jew? And I was like, no, they are people. They want to sell me stuff. So they treated me like they wanted to sell me things. And after that, I really just saw, you know, Zionism like crumble right before my eyes. And so I came back and I had done some organizing with Party for Socialism and Liberation. They gave me a lot of political grounding and historical grounding in Marxism and Leninism that I'm forever grateful for. But I will say the reason why I stuck it out with JVP as opposed to another leftist org is because of the Jewish part. It's so hard in Denver, in Colorado, and in many other cities to have a community of people who share your religion, which Judaism is already a very small religion. There's only about 14, 16 million Jews worldwide. There's not many of us. Very few of us, although that number is growing, very few of us believe that, or argue that Israel is an apartheid state and that Palestinians should have peace and justice. That's not something that the broader Jewish community shared prior to October 7th. Some of them are getting there. And so I think that, something that I really appreciate about JVP is the mixture of kind of like the spiritual aspect of Judaism and the religious practice within Judaism, and combining that with politics and praxis is extremely powerful. Because, something that I think about with Judaism is it is political, if you make it political. The exodus of Jews out of Egypt, I argue, is a labor struggle. That is when Jews physically struggled with divine intervention and were able to liberate themselves from oppression. And so that's kind of the work that we're trying to do within JVP, and that's why I love doing it.
Can I add a story before we move on?
Right in.
I think this sort of question of how do we meld the religious and the political is a really essential thing. And I think there's a really proud history of doing this in the United States for causes of justice. I think a lot of the proud tradition of, Black preachers in the South and the Freedom Riders and things of that sort, and sort of bringing that language. They also love the Book of Exodus, much like Jewish people. And I think that's a really clear through line that I've always seen. And in terms of how JVP is kind of bringing that back in a new age, I mean, one of the proudest things I've ever done with JVP was almost pretty much just over a year ago at this point, on the holiday of Tzom Tammuz. This is a very sad day in the Jewish calendar. It's when we mourn the destruction of the Second Temple, which is an act of profound grief that's kind of the basis of the entire Jewish religion. And it's based upon military violence. And this was also the day that Benjamin Netanyahu was going to visit Congress. And so JVP managed to sneak 300 people into Congress without them knowing, and we occupied that building and held a Tzom Tammuz service there when Netanyahu was there saying, stop arming Israel. We were all, of course, violently arrested, but that was still, I'd maintain, the best Tzom Tammuz I ever had.
Yeah, just very briefly, I graduated from college in May of 1966, and when I got home, I had 2 fully paid invitations for foreign travel. One was my draft notice to go to Vietnam, and the other was an invitation to join the Peace Corps in Tunisia. I agonized for about a millisecond. I turned to my mother, very deeply religious and also very Zionist Jewish person, and said, "Where's Tunisia, Mom?" She said, "I don't know." And, okay, I mean, pretty typical American story, isn't it? And, we looked at it on the map, and my mother says, "Oh, God, it's an Arab country." And then, in the same breath, she said, "Good, they're human too. Why don't you go there?" All right, I mentioned that. That's how I wound up there. But the main point here is I was in Tunis during the 1967 war. All right? And I basically think that if I had been in Brooklyn, I probably would still be a Zionist to this day. I mean, it's no different, having seen Exodus 3 times with my aunts and things like that. And it was that war and seeing that war from an Arab country that the whole notion that this was a war of survival, it was pretty clear from where I was sitting, it was a war of expansion. Okay, I mentioned all that, it wasn't like I was convinced of anything, but when I got out of the Peace Corps, I spent the next 3 years reading everything I could get my hands on to just try to understand, what had happened. So I mentioned that because that's basically the basis of why I got involved, and it was very simple. They were doing it in my name. And in fact, that's why I still do it to this day, all right? Because being Jewish has always meant something to me, a lot to me. In any case, when we talk about Zionism, we hear secular Zionism, religious Zionism. Could you two kind of enlighten us? I mean, how do we manage all these different forms of Zionism, liberal Zionism? What's all that about? Would you like to start with that?
I'd be happy to. I mean, I think this is a pretty well-informed crowd, but nonetheless, I feel like it's good to take it back to basics, right? To say that, I would say our gripe with Zionism in a lot of ways is that it's a very young movement. It's a very young movement that has gained a lot of momentum very, very quickly. And a millennia-year-old ethno-religion, whatever you want to call it, Zionism has only existed for, a little shy of 100 years at this point. And it started as a secular political movement, largely gaining momentum thanks to a man named Theodor Herzl. Herzl is called the father of Zionism. He wrote a book called Der Judenstaat. And whenever I think about Herzl, I'm really fascinated by a lot of the early ideas he had for what Zionism would be. He actually witnessed something called the Dreyfus Affair in France. He was a reporter who was covering it at the time. This was a tremendous anti-Semitic riot that happened. The whole story is not exactly worth getting into, but Dreyfus was basically condemned and kicked out of the country of France and sent into exile on a remote island, and Herzl witnessed the trial that was leading up to this. And from there, he basically said, there's nothing for us here. There's nothing for Jewish people in Europe. And Herzl was a very assimilated man. He had been trying to find his place in European society. He spoke good German. He cut off his side locks. He didn't wear a beard. He was not religious. And he saw basically the sort of people, I guess Alex and I said, all three of our ancestors maybe would have been, which is the dirty, grubby shtetl Jew. This is the one that only speaks Yiddish, doesn't know a lick of German, doesn't know a lick of English, lives in this isolated Jewish enclave, is the victim of anti-Semitism, has to flee the pogroms, and Herzl wanted to create a new Jew, a strong Jew. And so the way that I conceive of Zionism, and this certainly comes from my background and my family always having a bit of a distaste for it, but his original intention was not to revive Judaism, it was to replace it. And nonetheless, the Zionist movement is not solely defined by Herzl. There's many other people who have been a part of it, but it's sort of this ultimate solution to the question, the Jewish question, of how is it that we live in Europe. And I would say the position that we have is that we should challenge anti-Semitism wherever we may find it, that a multicultural society is a strong society, and that the same principles of persecution under capitalism and under Christian nationalism that we face are exactly the same chains that we have to break for all sorts of people. That exiling ourselves in a military stronghold and pointing rifles at anyone who gets close is not a robust vision of safety. But nonetheless, there's a lot of different visions of Zionism. I kind of wanted to lay the groundwork there with Herzl, but we should talk about the other ones too.
Jews at the end of the 19th century, they're in the same crisis as everybody else is, the crisis of emerging capitalism. And it changes everything. And so there were three options from what I could tell for Jews in those days. One was assimilation, all right? The other was revolution. And Jews were part of communist movements and became the Soviet Union. And, yes, very well represented to this day, right? And then the third option was Zionism, was this Jewish, and it really, as you said, it was, and for different reasons, the two other options begin to, we can talk about that later, they never had the same attraction that Zionism had, particularly for Eastern European Jews. So Alex, what's your take on all this?
Yeah, so like I said, where I grew up was a very kind of like liberal progressive Zionism of, we don't know why the Arabs hate us. They just hate us because we're Jews. And pretty much every Zionist will come up with that explanation of Arabs just hate us, which is frankly fakakta. It's ridiculous. It's absurd when you think about, the very long history of Jews in Europe and the very long history of Jews in Muslim and Arab lands. So the Jews in Europe were frequently persecuted. Pogrom after pogrom, riot after riot, expulsion after expulsion. One joke that I have with kind of my Ashkenazi Jewish friends is that we're all kind of cousins a little bit because, there's a chance that, Asa's family was kicked out of one village and Rob's family was kicked out of one village and my family was kicked out of one village, and we probably met each other somewhere in some shtetl and then had a family and then they were expelled somewhere. So it's just a long history of all of that in Europe. In the Middle East and in North Africa, though, while Jews had kind of a secondary status under the Ottoman Empire known as dhimmi status, which means they had to pay a tax known as the jizya, they were allowed to own land, they were allowed to hold office, they were allowed to be essentially important advisors. So one of the most important advisors to the Ottoman leader in Cairo was a rabbi named Maimonides. He had been kicked out of Spain and found his way into Cairo. He was a physician, he was a rabbi, he was the viceroy in Egypt, and he had written many texts, all of them in Arabic. The very first Siddur, the very first Jewish prayer book, was written by a man named Sadia Gaon in the 13th century, and he wrote that in Arabic. And so when liberal Zionists say this is about religion, it's not about religion, not even in the slightest. And so, that's, liberals like to kind of play identity politics in a way like that of these people hate us because they ain't us, and it's really, they hate us because we are, part of the capitalist, imperialist stronghold here in the United States and are promoting their destruction. So other types of Zionists out there, just like there are liberals, conservatives, and all kinds of other people, as Asa said, the very first supporters of Israel and Zionism were secular Jews. They actually had a revulsion towards religious Jews, interestingly enough. Yeah, they kind of thought of them as, these uneducated, shtetl folk that, he only really wanted Jews to move to occupied Palestine so that they could have a demographic shift. In terms of other types of Zionists, we've got the more conservative ones who are now coming more into power. And I think that the United States and Israel are, mirrors of each other in terms of their settler colonial projects. We have Trump, they have Netanyahu, and a lot of Americans think this isn't our country, and Israelis will say this isn't our country. And if you're a Marxist, you'll say this is a very expected conclusion to a settler colonial project that is built on exploiting people, and those contradictions are creating some of the most racist and vile people to be in power and to be voted into power. And when I was on a trip, there's a trip that I took in 2010, it's called Israel Study Tour. You spend 1 week in Poland. It's for high schoolers between junior year and senior year in the summer. You go from a week in Poland where they just say, here's why it sucked to be a Polish Jew, here's all these concentration camps, and then you spend 6 weeks in occupied Palestine, and your first stop is at this cemetery called Mount Olives, which is where my grandfather's cousin is buried. And it's essentially a cemetery for, important Jewish religious figures and Israeli soldiers. And what's remarkable about this trip, what I took away from it, was I had this one person who was our guide. He was American. Almost all of these shitheads are Americans, who say the most vilely racist things, because we're mirrors. Israel and the United States are mirrors. And just like the United States was not content with the 13 colonies, was not content with taking over the continental United States, is not content with having 800 military bases. We also need military bases in Caracas, Venezuela, and in Tehran, and in China, and in Russia. This counselor, he was telling us about how the real Israel should stretch all the way from the Mediterranean Sea all the way through Iraq to the Euphrates River. Some of you have probably heard more and more about this. It's called Greater Israel. And what's interesting about Israel is they don't define their borders in their constitution. That is extremely intentional. And that is because they want to extend the land of Israel all the way to Iraq, all the way to the very tip of the Sinai Peninsula, all the way up through Lebanon, which does not have a very robust Jewish history, because it's about domination. It's about being an imperialist. It's about upholding white supremacy. And that's kind of what the more conservative people in Zionism say. And this is something, when I think about my yeshiva classmates, who a lot of them are American, they believe in this idea wholeheartedly. And they also believe in destroying the Al-Aqsa Mosque and replacing it with the third Jewish temple. And so some liberal Zionists will say, we have nothing to do with those people. We want a two-state solution. And something that I think about when I'm talking to Zionists is I ask them, where does a two-state solution start and begin? Where did the borders start and end? You will not get a consistent answer. And so, with all of those different currents, of course you've got, the ultra-religious Jews, and then you've got the more secular Jews, and, you have Jews who believe that Israel's borders are great and fine where they are, and they don't like the settlements. And then you have Jews, many of whom who are American, who believe we should be all the way in Iraq.
And I think I want to touch on a few really critical things that Alex just brought up here, which is one, the unshaking belief in these borders as being something that is, divinely ordained for us. Because as I mentioned before, Zionism began as an explicitly atheist political movement. It wasn't until much later, decades and decades into its history, that Zionism gained a religious dimension. In America, most Jewish people, odds are, who you would meet, are part of the Reform movement. The Reform movement was founded in 1885 with this document called the Pittsburgh Platform. The founding text of the Reform movement states that it is fundamentally opposed to Zionism. They do not believe in the vision of a nation existing for Jewish people, and that is a promise that's religious in nature. It's because of a concept we have called galut, meaning exile. The idea is, it actually relates to that holiday, Som Samuz, I mentioned earlier. Our temple in Jerusalem was previously destroyed, and then Jewish people were flung all across the world. And we were meant to be something that we call the Shekhinah, which means that there's a little divine spark in every living thing. And we are supposed to help be the light among nations in finding that divine spark in all things. And for that reason, we are not supposed to have a country. You will not see a lot of times in Jewish history where there's been a Jewish king, a Jewish army, a Jewish invasion. You don't see this. And yet now that is the primary language that the people are using as they with their full chest believe in the logic of Zionism. And it's because they're looking at these stories that we find in the Torah describing these real places that actually exist and still exist and have been taken care of by Palestinians for millennia. And they think that they have the right to take over as these stewards and bulldoze everything in their path. I mean, I'm always reminded of the fact that in Gaza, during this most recent escalation, there was an old cemetery, a Jewish cemetery with Yiddish headstones that had been maintained by Palestinians for hundreds of years. They had taken care of graves that, as mostly Muslims and Christians in that area at that time, were not theirs. And so where does this religious basis for Zionism come from? As I said, it was a much later development. And I think if you want to learn more about where this movement sort of shifted, it's really important to look at Zev Jabotinsky and revisionist Zionism. He was the figure more than anything else that was clear-headed and completely lucid. The likes of David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, they sort of would, politic about it and say, we have to figure out some sort of solution to these Arabs. And Zev Jabotinsky said, we have to kill them. He said, that's what we're going to do. We have to kill them. And it was his ideology that led to these militias pre the state of Israel that kind of started this tradition of the religious zealotry combined with great violence that we now see in the modern settler movement. And these militias would become the precursor to the Likud, Netanyahu's current party. So we see a sort of lineage there. Likud has since broken from revisionist Zionism, and there's a whole other story there. But one last thing I want to touch on that we haven't quite mentioned yet is labor Zionism, which I think for those of us on the left especially is a really interesting and harrowing warning of how even a liberatory politic can be genocidal if you do not include all human beings in your vision of liberation. The Zionist movement was not popular for a very long time. Reform Judaism was against it. A lot of Jews in Eastern Europe were socialists, communists, and anarchists, and the idea of a Zionist state didn't really jive with a lot of us. And in fact, as I mentioned before, the Zionists had one main enemy. This was the Jewish Labor Bund. And the Bund would oppose Zionism everywhere they went. The Bund was far more popular for a very, very long time. They had day schools, recreation centers, restaurants, town squares, all Bundist. The Bund actually used to form militias that would patrol Jewish shtetls and with guns and keep people with pogroms who had the wish to do pogroms away. And their vision was, we are going to deal with anti-Semitism by overthrowing capitalism. And as soon as there's a revolution, these forces of the Russian Tsar and the governments in Eastern Europe that are oppressing us, that are instituting these laws, like, for example, Jewish people living on a shtetl, you couldn't visit Christian cities unless you had a special pass saying that you worked in a certain profession. And so these sorts of types of segregation that existed back then, the Bund challenged this and said, if we overthrow capitalism, we will be able to build a newer future free of anti-Semitism. And then, when the Russian Revolution occurred, the Bundists were betrayed by the Bolsheviks. They were an enormous force in making this revolution happen, and shortly thereafter there was a purge. And so the revolution had occurred, and anti-Semitism was part of it. And so suddenly the narrative that the Bund was resting on of look, we're going to improve things where we are now, we are going to be here where we live now, and build a classless society with equality for all people, suddenly that didn't really seem so compelling. And that was the rise of the Zionists. And so a lot of these people with these politics of socialism became Zionists. And that's where we get the kibbutz movement. There are these small agrarian settlements built around sharing resources, all of these amazing socialist principles. And you see these echoes in modern Israel today in the fact that it's a welfare state. I could move to Israel tomorrow and get subsidized groceries, subsidized rent, subsidized tuition, free healthcare, the works, and death for Palestinians. And so I think it's really important to understand that the Zionism as we know it today, which is mostly fundamentalistically religious, it is hard right, it is overtly racist, that everything that it took to get to this point, the first country to recognize Israel was the Soviet Union. And that's a hard blow to those on the left like myself. But I think it's important to remember at the same time to recognize that, this darkness of ideology can seep into any sort of movement.
We had talked about before how to organize this talk, and one of the things we have a bunch more questions, but we also said we didn't want to talk for more than 45 minutes, and it's 45 minutes. So I would, frankly, it's up to you. Look.
Ron, we said we weren't going to do it.
I know. I'm cruel, but that's how I am. But I would like to do that. I have to admit, maybe it'll come in the questions, but All right, so I think you got about as sophisticated a take. It really was, from my perspective, and I know this stuff just because I've been at it for so long, about where Zionism comes from, aspects of Zionism. But there's something else that really hasn't come up here. And I think, we're not sitting on Avenue K and Nostrand Avenue in Brooklyn, where my family comes from, which is still a very Zionist neighborhood. We're not in Ramallah. We're not in Gaza. We're sitting in Longmont, Colorado. All right, as you all know. All right. Having said that, it's still, even given this, what is the deal with U.S. support for Israel? Okay? All right? So I'm throwing it out. Maybe we could do it as a discussion, because we haven't really answered that. I know what we
Let
hear.
alone what we do about it.
Yeah, right. Well, we can get into all of that, depending on your questions. So that's my starting point. Is I've never really accepted this narrative that, oh, well, we're sister countries, they're democracies, and come on. I mean, that's, you know what that is, right? That's just nonsense. I.e., that's propaganda. What is the geopolitical reasons that the United States supports Israel, and supports, not just supports, okay, directs the genocide in Gaza, okay? Let's be clear on that. This would not only would it not happen if we weren't arming it, it's not true. The tail does not wag the dog. The dog wags the tail, all right? I.e., it starts from Washington. So I wanted to just get that out of my system. I did, all right? And let's open it up a little. Do you agree? I know you want to talk about
Absolutely
things, but I think, it's always, let's make it into a dialogue. So where do we begin? Sir?
Would it help to put this in the context of Christian Zionism?
You want us to talk about that? Which one do you want to talk about Christian Zionism?
I have a lot of thoughts on Christian Zionism.
That's an interesting, well, we should talk about it. It's a big movement here.
I see, and I'm really glad you brought that up, because I think there's two dimensions here. I mean, I think there's a very clear foreign policy one that you can clearly track the trends. Before the revolution in Iran was a U.S. puppet state. Before the Saudis became unreliable, the U.S. had a strong ally there. And as both of these conditions changed, that is suddenly the moment when you see the U.S. suddenly like Israel. America was not originally an ally of Israel. As Alex said earlier, it was the French and the English who were primarily the forces in the early days, and the Soviet Union. And then eventually that all changed, and then it became the U.S. And so I think just like that quick story of it really was as simple as the Joe Biden quote, I think you all know, of if we didn't have an Israel, we would need to create one. It goes down to that. But Christian Zionism, I think, is a motor that really makes this run in the lives more of everyday people than the actual institutions of military contractors in the Department of Defense,
Yeah, so I guess to kind of paint the imperial picture of why the United States loves Israel so much, one, when Israel was first being created, we saw a huge decolonization movement throughout the Middle East, throughout North Africa, throughout Asia. And almost every single one of those movements was either some kind of Marxist, some kind of leftist, some kind of, liberal social democrat. Basically what they wanted to do was nationalize their resources and then kick out the United States, kick out France, kick out Britain, kick out the Dutch, all of these different kinds of things. So it was kind of out of that existential crisis that created the support by the West for Israel, because they saw it as kind of their pipeline to stop leaders like Gamal Abdel Nasser, to stop leaders like Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran, and to stop a lot of these kinds of, just like in America, our left is pretty all over the place, and, the left movements and the decolonial movements, they had their own systems that they thought were going to work in their own specific ways, and all of them were disrupted by imperialist forces in the West, and Israel was the attack dog for many of them. And even more so later, in the 70s and 80s, did Israel become an attack dog in Latin America as well. But to answer your question about Christian nationalism and Christian Zionism, I think it's important to note that there are more Christian Zionists than there are Jews.
On the planet.
On the planet.
More, actually, may I correct, more Christian Zionists in America than there are Jewish people on the entire planet.
And there are more Christian Zionists who support Israel than there are Jews today. In fact, as Jewish support for Israel began to waver, and that happened before Gaza, if you look at the statistical data on it, the American leaders of the Zionist movement, they needed a big ally, and they turned to the Christian Zionists. Now, I haven't talked about the ideology of it or work. It actually is an old idea, right? The British, they had their version of it, although it wasn't not particularly practical. But if you look at who Christian Zionists are today, and the movement is Christians United for Israel. And the leader is, and I really don't throw terms out like this very much, but he's about as close to a fascist as you can get, John Hagee. And so look, as American support, Jewish American support for Israel begins to decline, AIPAC and the ADL and organizations like that, they turn to the Christian Zionists. And their version is why do they support Israel? It's this messianic notion, the end of the world, kind of nonsense. What?
Armageddon.
Yes, Armageddon. Yes. And one story, Hagee and the Christian Zionists, they have a big support here. It's over there in Wheat Ridge. What's the name of it? It's a big megachurch.
Red Rocks?
No, that's not what it is.
Focus on the family?
What?
Those guys too.
No, that's in the Springs. What? No. Okay. Well, all right. I forget that it's
We
in
didn't
our
do
valley.
enough research on
Yeah,
it.
there's a lot of mega churches, but this one, and I'm there with my. By the way, my wife Nance is not Jewish, and for years this was my issue. She has her own. She has plenty of issues, including me. I guess I'm one of the issues. But having said that, and I don't exactly know how it happened, but for her, this is the issue today. It's not. I guess I know, of course, we want to talk about it as of course, it's a Jewish issue because of Zionism. It's not just a Jewish issue. It's a human rights issue. It is a universal issue. Everybody has a stake in this issue, and you don't have to be Jewish to be critical of Israel. Okay. Anyhow, without going through the history of it, it is probably a more important political force today, Christian Zionism, than Jewish Zionism. It's very powerful, particularly in the level of Congress. It has great influence. Another question, yes.
I was just going to carry on with your comment that the Christian Zionists actually contribute more money than AIPAC.
You know what I forgot to ask? Could you mention your name?
Sure.
Everybody should do that.
My name is Joni, and I wanted to comment on your comment, which is that the Christian Zionism movement has more money than the AIPAC movement even has. And you can look up any of our representatives on opensecrets.org and see how much money each person has taken. I understand that some of our representatives here in Colorado even carry Israeli passports because they visited Israel on these junket trips that Israel sponsors for Congress
Bennett
people.
for sure. I'm not sure of all the others.
Bennett for
but
sure.
Bennett for sure.
And I guess my other point is that back in the 70s, I think, or maybe the early 80s, the AIPAC lobby was so strong at that point, but we never heard about it. But 2 Congress people, after leaving their positions, wrote a book called They Dared to Speak
Right.
Out.
Right.
So it's not just recent, it's been going on
Yes.
for a long time.
Yeah.
But that's,
Okay.
that's part of the conversation too, I think.
Yeah, I think as kind of part of the religious Christian Zionist understanding of why they support Israel and how it relates to Armageddon. So this idea that if all the Jews are kind of moved into this one little enclave called Palestine, and they rebuilt the third Holy Temple, the Holy Temple which has been destroyed 2 times, and after the destruction of the second one, that's where we get, the creation of synagogues and the creation of really modern Jewish life as we know it, because we don't have a temple to sacrifice bulls and goats and whatnot into anymore. So we create synagogues, and so what the Christian Zionists want us to do is to create that third temple by destroying Al-Aqsa Mosque. They want us all to move there, and then when we're all there, when everyone's there, somehow the world's just gonna kind of nuke itself, and the redemption...
And we all become Christians.
Yeah. Oh yeah. The ones of us who don't become Christians, we can burn in hell.
Downstairs.
And the ones of us who convert, we, get shot up into the sky into this holy redemption. So,
And something I'd like to add here is, the Talmud teaches us that Messiah is born every generation in the Jewish religion. And the question is whether the people who live in that generation deserve the Messiah. And so there's an anti-Zionist kind of a portion of the Talmud that I think is really valuable called the 3 Oaths. And basically what it states is that we cannot hasten any sort of building of the third temple until Hashem, God, ordains it. That the act of trying to speed up this process is basically just being spiritually impatient. We also don't believe in hell. I just want to say that too. And I think this thought of Christian Zionism, the idea that it is an advantageous political relationship for Jewish Zionists and for Christian Zionists, but it's predicated on something that as a Jewish person I find deeply offensive. I had an interaction with a woman in an airport once. It was actually when I was leaving Washington, D.C. when Netanyahu came to Congress, and I was wearing my Star of David in the airport. I had sustained some injuries during my arrest. My arm was in a sling. This woman comes up to me and she says, "Oh, I love your Star of David. It's so beautiful. What happened to you? Are you okay?" And I said, "Oh, I was hurt protesting for Palestine." And she said, "You don't like Israel?" And I said, "No." And she said, "You're going to burn in hell." And I think that just about sums up how Christian Zionists treat Jewish people. When we're a useful tool, we're useful. But at the end of the day, it's based on this eschatological, fantasy of bringing about the end times that sees both Jewish people and Palestinians as pawns. And the last thing I'll say on kind of the financial nature, which I'm really glad that you brought that up, of just literally money and politics going to politicians, but there's also another dimension I think is really important, which is I think we often talk about these vast sums of money of aid that are going to Israel from the United States. Eye-watering numbers, right? And one thing that blew my mind that I learned from an economics expert who studies divestment, who works a lot with JVP, is that every dollar that we spend supporting Israel is actually a dollar that goes back into our economy. It doesn't stay, the money doesn't stay in Israel. It is the Israeli military basically gaining funds from U.S. congressional authority to buy U.S. military contracts. So it's actually us who get richer from all of the money that we send to Israel. And the way that I see it is our entire lifestyle of the utmost convenience, of constant disposable goods, of so much luxury that we see in the United States today, it is subsidized by Palestinian death. Our economy is stimulated by it. And I'll also mention that, the Rafah tent massacre that occurred last year, a New York Times munition expert analyzed this. I recently talked about this in an anti-Semitism investigation earlier this week. It was pretty rough. But the bombs that were used in the Rafah tent massacre that we have videos of immolating entire Palestinian families, they were manufactured in Colorado. They were manufactured here. And so We live in a globalized world. This is a global conflict. It might seem like it's far away. It might not seem like it's relevant to you, but if you live on this land, you are living where they're making these bombs. So it matters to all of us. Any more questions?
Only 144,000 Jews will convert and get sent up into space.
Oh, yeah, you're right. Absolutely right.
12,000 from each tribe. All the rest of them will burn in hell according to Christian Zionism.
You're absolutely right. Yeah. When you look at it carefully, it's a formula. It's another Holocaust. What they're talking about, and nothing short of that.
And what's really interesting too is that in these more liberal Zionist circles, is that the Christian Zionist perspective is just an elephant in the room that they entirely ignore. They act like it's not part of the equation. And what's really interesting too is that they'll kind of pull this, well, Martin Luther King supported Israel, and a lot of rabbis in the civil rights movement supported Israel. That was all before 1967, the Six-Day War, where Israel took the Golan Heights, which they still control today, and they took over the Sinai Peninsula and destroyed the entire Egyptian Air Force in one day. They said it was a defensive mechanism. There's no defense there. And also, interestingly, too, they destroyed a U.S. battleship in the Mediterranean Sea, which, yes, the USS Liberty, which, as we saw earlier this week, the United States can blow up a Venezuelan fishing boat and say it's full of narco-terrorists. But when Israel destroys an entire battleship, an aircraft carrier, it's not investigated. It's not looked at. And that's because that's a cost that the U.S. is very much willing to take into consideration when trying to maintain its imperial goals and its geopolitical power. So, it's something that liberal Zionists will not talk about, is that these Christian Zionists and how rampantly anti-Semitic they are, and how their biggest supporters are actually some of the most racist and vile scumbags that you can find. It's getting much, 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 much harder for them now.
Yeah. This Christian fundamentalist church, the name of which I have forgotten, we're out there demonstrating because my wife insisted I go, so I gotta go. She's out there every week now. Every week she's out there. But anyhow, I'm standing there, and it's a big place. I mean, thousands of people are coming in. And who?
Located?
Sorry?
Where is this church located?
It's in Arvada. It's right by the Costco in Arvada on Wadsworth. I'm sorry. I use my age as an excuse. I don't remember the name of it just as well, probably. But the bottom line is, I see a delegation, okay, of the leadership of the Colorado Jewish community, the most prominent rabbis, the representative of the ADL, the representative of AIPAC, who I know who he was anyhow at the time, and they're going in. They're going in to pay tribute to John Hagee, all right? And, again, if you've been involved in this for a long time, the rabbis know me, I know the rabbi, it's a small community, it's not that big community.
We all know each other.
Exactly, right.
We were all kind of cousins at one point.
So I'm waving to them, okay? You're going in, hey, just kind of try to embarrass them a little bit. And they turn and say, what are you doing here protesting us? And I look at them, I say, what are you doing here going in to sit with Hagee? So the connection was already, and this was a decade ago, very, very, it was already there, and it's just become stronger, very strong. So this is the kind of allies today that, that the Zionist movement in this country have had to. All right, I'll get back to you, but I want to know if there's anybody else who wants to say something.
I just wanted to tell you the name of the church.
What is it?
Faith Bible Church.
Yeah, thank you.
Faith Bible
It's
Church.
Faith Bible. Yes, it's an enormous church. I mean, it's quite a production. Yes.
Faith
Bible
Church.
Chapel. It's a big one, yeah. Name? Hi.
My name's Hamish.
Hamish.
And this question might sound like it's more tactical. It might sound like it comes from a social media argument, because it does. But I'm wondering if there's if you can give me some historical depth to an answer to somebody that thinks that it's useful to bring anti-Zionist messages, or even just messages that question the relationship between the U.S. and Israel through to people that haven't heard those before, but it's important that they're coming through the mouths of people from the right, maybe some of these media figures who have been deplatformed and are not as mainstream on the right anymore, but have are still finding a niche by saying something that gets people
You mean
riled
the
up,
Tucker
right?
Carlson, Candace Owens situation?
Yeah, right. That's probably what you're
That
talking
Nick
about.
guy.
Yeah, Tucker Carlson, and now what's the name of the representative?
Marjorie.
Yeah, Marjorie.
Taylor Greene,
Yeah. Okay, I will go on.
So
and
the
then I'll
question,
make a few
I just want to make
comments
sure I understand your question. You're basically asking, is there a real tactical, strategic value in having anti-Zionist messaging come from
about it.
these sorts, like the right?
Yes, and
Yeah.
what are the dangers?
Yeah, actually, that's one of the questions we didn't really get to in our little time slot. So I'm really happy you brought it up. I mean, I want to hear what these two think as well, because of course it's something we talk about all the time. But what I think is an inevitability is the fact that much like Zionism is not a distinctly left-wing or right-wing movement, that it has elements of both. Anti-Zionism has also always had a left-wing basis and a right-wing basis. I think that the values of, don't drone strike people is a pretty universal left-wing sort of thing. And yet you will also see people on the right kind of making these more humanitarian sorts of arguments. And I honestly will say, I don't always think it's ingenuine. I think in a lot of ways these people are still deeply racist against Arab people, and so I question the level of commitment that they're willing to show towards Palestinians. And I think, frankly, I'm grateful that the conversation has shifted. I mean, I've been in the pro-Palestine movement, as I mentioned, since I was 13, 14 years old, and the numbers I used to see at marches were very, very small. And if the contradictions are cracking at such an expansive scale that even people on the right are saying this bloodshed is too much, I'm grateful to see that. But I'm not grateful to see people like Candace Owens, who basically take conspiracy theories about Jewish power and Jewish control of the media, Jewish control of government, and pretty much transplant them on top of these humanitarian criticisms of the state of Israel. And I think it's really important to be clear-headed about that. I mean, as Rob said, the tail doesn't wag the dog. What Israel is doing right now could never be possible without the support of imperial colonial powers behind it. I guess that's all I have to say on that, if you two have more to add.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I want to say that, the ilks of Candace Owens, Tucker Carlson, and Marjorie Taylor Greene, if they were at one of our protests, I'd call them a fuck ass and tell them to eat shit and die. Sorry, I wasn't going to
Seconded.
As a principled communist, that's what I would say. And, yes, I think Asa answered that question beautifully. Kind of another dimension that I want to add to that is the religious anti-Zionist perspective.
100%.
That also exists. So raise your hand if you've heard of a group called Neturei Katara. They're these ultra-Orthodox...
You've probably seen them.
Yeah, they're these ultra-Orthodox Jews who come donning keffiyehs, who've got these really wonderful signs that say, Zionism is not halachic, it doesn't follow Jewish law. There's a reason you don't see any women from those groups.
They're not good to women.
They're not good to really anyone.
they don't teach their kids how to read. They don't know how to do math. I mean, they're horribly unequal social conditions there. I would say Palestine is probably about the only issue we would align with them on.
Yeah. So these folks, while, you know, a broken clock is right, you know, twice a day, they, you know, they're right on that. They're right that, you know, there's not a good religious reason for the state of Israel to exist. This group also said that the reason why the Holocaust happened was because Jews were being too secular and were assimilating and, you know, were becoming less and less religious. And there's a neighborhood in Jerusalem that I visited once called Mera Sharim. Ultra Orthodox. They do not actually speak Hebrew. They only speak Yiddish. And that is because they believe that when you speak Hebrew, it should only be for religious purposes. They despise the state of Israel because they see it as they're going to make their kids secular and they're going to make their kids not religious anymore. And so when you see these fights between Israeli cops and these ultra-Orthodox people, you know, maybe some of them care a little bit about the humanity of Palestinians. I would say the overwhelming majority of them don't really care much about what's happening outside of their own neighborhood or outside of their own house. And so, you know, their kind of shtick is we support Palestine because we don't believe there should be a state of Israel. But it's not anything humanitarian whatsoever. And, you know, there are also, you know, more right-wing waves and different types of people within the pro-Palestine movement. Spicy take about Iran. While I'm not going to say I think that the United States should overthrow their government, I'm firmly anti-imperialist and think that the Iranian people will choose their own destiny. You know, they have a right-wing theocratic government, who I do not want to overthrow, by the way. They can figure it out on their own. And they support the Palestine movement. They're one of the biggest supporters of the Palestine movement. And not just, you know, not just through word and deed, or not just through word, but also in deed. So, you know, they're the ones that are physically bombing Tel Aviv and these other sites. And, you know, if Israel got into a war with Iran, they would get their shit rocked. And so, you know, while I don't necessarily, you know, align with the government of Iran, I'm thankful that they support Palestine, and I'm thankful that they're serving as a wedge between U.S. imperial interests and the interests of the capitalists who just want to balkanize that country and sell all their oil reserves to Shell and Chevron. You know, their resources belong to them, and they can figure out and fight for their own needs. I don't need to do that as an American.
And so I think at the end of the day, the real strategic thing here is, what do we do with these strange bedfellows? What do we do with these other people in the movement? And I think Alex just said it greatly, which is we can say, you know, we're happy to have you on our side. Let's make sure it's for the right reasons.
You know, it's kind of fun to finally disagree with these two. All right? You know, it doesn't really matter what the issue is. Politics in America is messy. All right? Period. You know, earlier we talked about liberal Zionists who connect to Haiti and Christians United. They have no hesitation. They know who they are, okay? So when I see somebody, what's the guy on the commentators, you know, famous one?
Tucker Carlson.
Tucker Carlson, who, by the way, is an acknowledged, he'll tell you in half his programs, he's a white racist. All right, period. But you need to understand something about the movement that supports Trump. It's got really two big wings. One are these, my take, these religious nutcases, okay, Christian fundamentalist types. But the MAGA types, a lot of them come out of a kind of anarchist tradition, and their approach to this is they don't want. they don't want U.S. aid. They don't want U.S. bases. They're serious about that. I mean, I have some guys I play poker with in Denver for 20 years. They support Trump. They are anti-interventionalists. Okay, now, if the Republican Party, part of the base of the Republican Party, is taking a position against what the United States is doing there, i.e. arming Israel, all right, and sympathetic to the Palestinians and what's happening in Gaza, oh man, cool. As far as I'm concerned, I'm glad. And I don't think about it as Tucker Carlson. I think about the base of the Republican Party that is also turning in a good way, and Tucker Carlson understands that. So this doesn't bother me at all. I think, and in fact, you know, the idea that somehow on this issue that some kind of purist approach, everybody has to have the same ideas about two-state or one-state. By the way, for me it's a non-issue. We have nothing to do with how that's going to be settled, all right? And everyone's like, are you two-state? Are you one-state? So no, my name's Rob Prince. I'm neither,
Ask
okay?
the Palestinians.
Right, but it's a mixed thing. So what I look at is, who's walking with me part of the way? All right? Are they serious? Are they principled? Okay? Are they going to be nice to me today and then stab me in the back? The way so many liberal Zionists have done for decades here in Colorado? All right? If they're principled about their position on this, it's not like I'm going to support Tucker Carlson. I appreciate it. I appreciate that he's taking the position that he's taking, and I'll work with him and I'll walk along with him. You know, I always look for in politics what I call a united front approach. And what is that? It's basically you're dealing with people that you don't agree with them on a lot of things, but you did find some common ground. All right? It doesn't mean I'm going to cheer for Tucker Carlson or Trump or anything, but on this issue, we need them. And I'm glad they're there, and it doesn't bother me at all, and it doesn't dirty my hands. Nobody's going to change my mind about how I look at things. And if they're willing to work with me, I'll work with them. So I see it as a positive development, believe it or not, and I'm not concerned. And I also don't have any illusions about how long the connection will last. But for now, we're walking together, so let's keep walking. Somebody we haven't heard from? Okay.
Hi, I'm going to stand. Sorry, I have the mic. So, hi, my name is Phoebe, and as we talked about earlier, anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism have become conflated in the past, probably longer than the past few months. But I kind of wanted to ask, like, when did that start becoming like a tactic that America and, you know, that Congress, America, and our institutions have been using to crack down on the pro-Palestine movement? And that's my question.
This is a very good question. So, like we said before, 1939, Zionism was not popular, not even amongst a lot of institutions today that are very Zionist. So, for example, you know, prior to 1939, Chabad, a very ultra-religious institution, one of their rabbis said that, you know, we should not support the state of Israel for the reasons that we had named previously. And something big happened in 1939. The Holocaust happened. So a lot of the leftist Jews who were anti-Zionists were murdered. A lot of the Americans living in, or American Jews in the United States, they were shocked by the Holocaust. Rightfully so. The Holocaust was a horrendous event for not just Jewish people, but for millions of other people as well. across all different types of religious backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, sexual and gender backgrounds, ability backgrounds, and the like. It was terribly horrendous for everyone. And the Holocaust significantly shifted the idea of what Israel meant for Jews. Because what it meant was that, we couldn't stop the Holocaust. We now need to protect ourselves in some kind of way. And instead of forming solidarity with, the other groups of people in their locale, they moved either to the United States, many moved to France, many moved to England, many also moved to Palestine. And what's also interesting too is there were Zionist officials in Europe who were physically trying to, redirect Jews who were even trying to get to America into Palestine. So even people who didn't even want to go to Palestine were forced to go to Palestine post the Holocaust. And it wasn't until 1967, I would say, when Israel in the Six-Day War, they got land gains in the West Bank, they got land gains in the Golan Heights, and they got land gains in the Sinai Peninsula, that the United States started really seeing them as an important partner. At this time also, we have an organization called the Anti-Defamation League. Now, the Anti-Defamation League was started in 1909. It started as kind of a civil rights group. And some of their organizers were even helping with the freedom struggle in the South and trying to get people registered to vote who were black. And some of their own members were lynched in the South. And after 1967, after the Six-Day War, and especially after the 1973 Yom Kippur War, is when we see the ADL significantly shift their focus to that of less so combating general bigotry and more so to institutionalize Zionism. And also by this time too, we're seeing more and more Jewish people supporting Israel. The reason why Jewish people in America didn't initially support Israel is because they want to fight off accusations of dual loyalty. They're not doing a very good job now.
What is dual loyalty?
So dual loyalty is something that is really as old as Judaism, really. You can find it even in the Torah when the Jews were in Mitzrayim in Egypt. This is something that the Pharaoh accused Jews of that if an opportunity were to arise, the Jews would be loyal to whoever would have the most power and essentially screw us over. And so a lot of Jews in America prior to the Holocaust and prior to 1967 didn't openly support Israel to the extent that we see now because they didn't want to be accused of being un-American, essentially. They wanted to assimilate, they wanted to be part of the culture, just like Jews have always wanted to do in some way, shape, or form, is they wanted to be like the populace that they were living in while retaining their own religious identity. And so after 1967, and especially after the 1973 Yom Kippur War, especially after the Yom Kippur War, which was launched on Yom Kippur. So the Israeli army, the reason why there were so many gains by the United Arab Front is because they launched it on the Jews' most sacred holiday, Yom Kippur. So even the army and their most important commanders were in synagogue that day. And so that's where the ADL said, okay, we can really make this about this conflation. Why would these Arab countries attack us on our holiest of day? They must really hate Jews. And so we've seen since 1973 that huge conflation. And we're seeing it especially now, as you pointed out.
And there's one thing I'd really like to add, because I think this story is the most important story in the American-Israeli partnership. And this is an anecdote that comes, I feel like it's best illustrated in a story that Norm Finkelstein tells in the intro to his book, The Holocaust Industry. Some of you might know who Norm Finkelstein is. He's the son of 2 Holocaust survivors of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And he said that growing up in New York City prior to 1967 and prior to the Yom Kippur War, you know, all of his friends and all the people in his community, they cared about political issues, and they never once asked his parents about what they survived. There was never a, oh, you were in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising? Never a word. Never, you survived Auschwitz? Oh my God. Never a word. Never a peep. And it wasn't until the primetime news coverage of the 1967 war and the 1973 war that suddenly the American imagination, the non-Jewish American imagination, became captivated by the Holocaust. Because the narrative that they said as Israel was sort of defending this onslaught against all of these, you know, savage Arab countries, is that they're preventing a second Holocaust. That's specifically what Walter Cronkite said. And this stuck in the minds of a lot of people, and this became very influential. This is when you start seeing more books being written about the Holocaust. In the period immediately after the Holocaust, less than 5 books were written about it at all. And so I think that's where you really get into this narrative, when there was the buckling down of the Zionist consensus, as we call it.
Yeah, the 67 war is the turning point, 67, 73. But there's more recent developments that I want to just mention here. Because frankly, you know, those of us in the peace movement, in religious institutions, in the left, we've talked about the separation of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism for a very, very long time. There's nothing new about that. So the question is, why is the conflating of the two? If you're anti-Zionism, if you're anti-Zionist, you're quote, anti-Semitic. Where did that come from? So I'm going to give you my take on it, because it really has just exploded in a way that, at least I don't remember it being this strong. And here's my take. Since October 7th, what has happened? We've had a sea change here. Now, whether it's for social media or whatever, it's not the same. The sympathy for the situation of the Palestinians has soared. And here's my take on what kind of like the Zionist institutions are doing. They've given up on the street. Now, I want to tell you, I'm having a good time here. For years, if I went and spoke somewhere, there was either there was some rabbi calling the school or the church and saying, don't let this guy speak, you know, i.e., they tried to stop us. And if we demonstrated, there'd be counter-Zionist demonstrators, and they were not nice, as my mother would say. But okay, now, what I noted, when all this started after October 7th, my concern is, oh my God, we're going to go out on the street and bam, you know, oh my God, they're going to be there everywhere. And I'm worried. I can't help it. I'm really a Jewish mother in disguise, all right? And I'm worried. I worry about these young Jewish kids, and because I know what it was like. It's not like that anymore. They have retreated. The Zionists, it seems to me, yeah, every once in a while, I know there's some guy in Boulder, and he's there every Saturday, and he does his nonsense or whatever. But for the most part, they don't touch that. Where the struggle is in the institutions, in the universities, in the political parties, and that's where they're coming on really, really strong. Now, how do they get away with that? All right, they're not going to say we're repressing, and basically, we are the anti-racist element of the Jewish community, and they're calling us racist. You know, say you're anti-Semitic, that's racism. So what are they? It's a very clever thing. You should keep this in mind. It's basically taking the offensive. That's all. Rather than trying to control the narrative. They've lost that on the street. All right. And so one of the ways that they protect themselves now is it's very important for them that anti-Zionism be seen as anti-Semitism, because then they can say, well, you know, we're the ones who are fighting racism. These people are, you know, they're just blah, 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 blah. So it's not so much that the idea is so new, but the concentration on making, like what's going on with you at Auraria, they're trying to say the encampment there was anti-Semitic. and they're having hearings that are going to go to Washington, D.C., and it's the beginning of a McCarthyite witch hunt, all right? And that's what they're using. So being able to counter that now is very, very, very important, and it's going to take some time. It's not going to be so
If I can add a quick point on countering that, raise your hand if you've heard of the IRA definition of anti-Semitism.
The what definition?
The IRA,
Oh, right.
International Holocaust Remembrance Association. So this has been on my mind a lot because, as Rob mentioned, I was one of the organizers of the encampment. There is currently a civil rights investigation into whether the encampment was anti-Semitic. And as a lead negotiator and a Jewish organizer of the encampment, my testimony, whew, my friends, it's hard. But I've really had to do my homework because, as Rob has said, it's primarily in the legal and structural realm, and now they're entirely taking this fight. And they're concocting a legal scenario that does not have an old basis in legal precedent. And the reason why I want to bring that up is because the cudgel that they are using, whether it's the investigations on my campus that I have to testify for, whether it's the beating down of Columbia University, whether it's the attacks against Harvard, UCLA. I mean, at JVP, they had an event where all of us students who organized our various encampments, they got us all together at a secret undisclosed location for us to talk about our experiences, and all of us were facing this, all of this. And the main weapon they're using is the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. And this is one that, as an alternative to things like the Jerusalem Declaration, also composed by experts on anti-Semitism, it's seen as the one that more directly conflates, anti-Semitism is anti-Zionism. And the language they use here is they say, the denial of the Jewish people to the right to self-determination and, attacks against any sort of affiliation or identification with Israel. And the thing that I think is the most fascinating is there's a man who wrote the IRA definition. His name is Kenneth Stern. He was previously an anti-Semitism expert for the AGC, and in the last 5 years, he has been going to the press constantly and ringing the bell and saying, I never meant for it to be used this way. I never meant for this to be a weapon against pro-Palestinian speech. He said, I never meant for Jewish self-determination to mean the annihilation of Palestinians. I never meant for Jewish people not being blamed for the actions of Israel to mean that Israel can never be criticized. I mean, he has been going to everyone he possibly can saying, please, someone stop this. And so I think the fact that nonetheless the IRA definition, despite its author pleading with people to stop, has now become the main weapon of this sort of conflation, speaks to the artificial basis of, lawyers, of the nonprofit industrial complex, of Zionist institutions. They are putting all of their weight behind this institutional struggle. Every single person who is a fellow, person testifying in front of this panel, they were all there, paid as a part of their job with the Zionist organization. I was the only person who was there just as an independent political actor, and so I think that says a lot.
Arif, do we have more time?
Yeah.
Do we have more questions? Oh, yeah, we do. Way in the back.
Hello, my name is Allie. So my question is something you guys briefly touched on. What do you think the role of Islamophobia and hatred of Arab people and just Islam in general is in the genocide of Palestinian people, and how that's evolved over the few past decades, and how it relates to the Islamophobia in the States, and this kind of purist, eugenicist, white colonialist vision of Israel.
Okay.
Yeah, so Islamophobia and hatred towards Arab people is as American as apple pie, and is about as old as this country is in different variations. We really see this kick off, like I said, after the Holocaust, and Europe is in shambles. France, Germany, and England do not have the same control over their colonial projects that they once had. And even in the 1880s and the 1900s, just like almost every group of people, there was some kind of phobia against them. And this really changed in the 1950s. So in the 1950s, Jews in America really started to lean into their whiteness. Same with Irish people, same with Italian people, same with Slavic people. There used to be a lot of hatred towards Catholic people until even during John F. Kennedy's presidency, he was getting a lot of flack for being a Catholic president and whether or not he would be loyal to America or more loyal to the Vatican. And, you know, once all of these different groups who could have formed solidarity with one another across different racial and ethnic lines, a lot of these groups started to lean more into their whiteness and lean more into racism. And so whether it's through, you know, the spaghetti westerns of the 1950s and 60s, or anything like that, you know, it was really a response to these Middle Eastern movements that were decolonial, and they saw it as a way to attack these people through Islamophobia, because if you other someone, you can get people behind your movement. And so this became even more so true in the 1980s and after 1979, after the Iranian Revolution. This played a huge role for how the United States thought of the Middle East, because now, so Iran in 1953, they had a kind of like liberal-ish nationalist president named Mohammad Mossadegh, and in Operation Ajax, one of the CIA's first operations, they overthrew him and planted in someone named, I don't even remember his name, but he was called the Shah. Pavli. And he essentially ran, you know, an authoritarian police state. And the United States loved him because he helped get a lot of the oil revenue that was in Iran to U.S. companies and to British companies like BP, British Petroleum. And so after the Iranian Revolution of 1979, you can see the United States really take a sharp turn towards Islamophobia and towards a phobia of Arab people. And, you know, even, you know, if you watch any kind of TV show in the 80s or in the 90s, there's this huge obsession, even before 9/11, with, you know, this Arab horde, as the, you know, they kind of think of it. And so we've kind of had this conditioning for almost 50 years, and then 9/11 happens, which was huge for the United States in terms of policing and attacking anyone who was even remotely Muslim adjacent. So even Sikhs and Hindus who wore head wraps, they were the victim of assaults post 9/11. I was only in second grade when 9/11 happened, so I don't have too much context on that. But, you know, I think the Iranian Revolution really played a huge role in the uptick of how the United States viewed Arab and Muslim people, and especially so after 9/11. And especially when it comes to the question of Palestine, when Hamas becomes an entity in 1987 during the Second Intifada. So prior to the First Intifada, So prior to the First Intifada, there weren't that many armed Palestinian groups. There was the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO. They had dispersed kinds of resistance to the occupation, but it wasn't until 1987, and also in the Second Intifada, when we saw the uptick of suicide bus bombings and market bombings, that the United States and Israel could really play on this. These people don't care about human life. They would rather die in some suicide operation than live in a dignified way or be living on side of us. And even today, you'll hear Zionists talk about suicide bus operations as to why they can't get behind, a Palestinian state, or why they believe that the wall in the West Bank should remain up. And after the Second Intifada, even Hamas has said, we're going to stop doing those operations for the most part. And so, while that is my kind of all over the place answer, I'll let Asa add a little bit more context.
I'm really happy you brought that up, because it reminds me to go back to our old friend, the ADL. They were really integral in the fact that the first time the word terrorist was ever used in an actual government document by any intelligence agency, police force, it hadn't even been used in the press yet. The first time the word terrorist was ever really put on paper in a big way was condemning Palestinians working for UNRWA, by connecting them to the sorts of plane hijackings that members of the PFLP had done during the 1970s. And I bring up the ADL because the ADL, again, they've been losing the battle in the streets for a long time. At this point, I would say they hadn't quite yet, but they were still throwing their force behind the legal and structural means of protecting sort of Zionist interests, read Jewish interests, as they see them. And after the Oklahoma City bombing by Timothy McVeigh, there was some of the first, anti-terror legislation that was ever passed in the United States. Timothy McVeigh was a homegrown American white supremacist anti-Semite, I will add. And none of the laws that were passed to respond to his bombing actually targeted any of those people. They targeted Arab people in other countries, and specifically Palestinians. And so I think the specter of Palestinian resistance for what it has always meant to the Arab world and the whole pan-Arabist movement is they kind of see it as the nexus and the great strength of fighting the power, being kind of that last bastion of where the colonial fight is still happening. And it's a very, very powerful movement for those people, and it strikes fear into the heart of American empire here. And I want to add that I think, nothing I could say to this point would do it better than Orientalism by Edward Said. I think the specific and unique form of racism that Arab people face is best described there. I would also recommend, if you don't want to read a whole book, there's a paper that I think clears up a lot of the way in which Arabness and Muslimness is erased in Israel proper. It's called The Politics of Verticality. If anyone wants it, I have a file. Come find me after. And to sort of close all of this out, I mean, these are, Alex gave a great, I think, political foreign policy based kind of explanation of that. But to kind of speak to the spiritual death that's occurred here, as we've denied this historic lineage of connection that's existed between Muslims and Jewish people forever. I mean, we're both of Sephardi descent, and the Sephardic culture would not have existed without the kindness of Muslims. Because we, Sepharad is basically Spain in the Torah, we're the Jews of Spain. And Spain was ruled by a caliphate of Muslims. And it was under that caliphate that those Muslims created patronage for Jewish arts. They built all of these gorgeous synagogues. They sponsored what I see as the Harlem Renaissance of Jewish people. All of this art, all of this music, all of these songs that my grandparents still sang hundreds of years later. The fact that we were exiled from Spain 500 years ago and we're still singing the same songs, I mean, that must have been something pretty powerful. And that culture only exists because the Muslim people that we lived alongside said, we see you as our brothers of the book. And they paid money for our religious and cultural flourishing. And so the fact that today we're not returning the favor is one of the biggest animating forces I see, and always centering a care for Muslims and such in this work.
Very briefly, every time we go to war, and as you know, we go to war a lot, we vilify whoever it is. So whether it was the Japanese before World War II, whether it's the hysteria about Iran today, and so yeah, I just feel. I mean, I grew up. It was not a political family, okay. They were not at all. But when the debates would take place in my family, and they did, and my mom was the last of 14, so I have a lot of cousins. And Israel, Palestine, that was already, we were talking about that a long time ago. And if you really wanted to get a rise out of my uncles, you just used the name Yasser Arafat, and that would do it. And, my mom's watching this great debate between cousins, aunts, and uncles. She doesn't know Arafat from a hole in the wall, all right? And what'd she say? And she's getting really upset because the discussion it was pretty ugly, the way it went. My mom's politics are real simple. Aren't we all human? That was it. Oh yeah, Arafat, yeah, maybe he's not a nice man. That the world is divided between the nice men and the not nice men, in our view. But we have some not nice people too in our community. I just think of Islamophobia. It's a form of racism. The one thing, things don't look really good now, but when I think what the United States might contribute to world civilization, because now it doesn't look so good, is that maybe we've learned how to eliminate racism. That's it. Capitalism has been around for a long time. And so this whole question, can we do it? Now, right now, it doesn't look real good, does it? But okay, history goes up and down. That's the big thing. So I just consider it any form of racism. I've got to be against it. And frankly, it's true of everybody in this room. All right, and that's one of the terrible things that they're trying to take away. Look, this term woke. I can't stand. What are they using this term for? Woke. Those of they quote woke is to say, oh, you're woke. They're attacking people who are anti-racist. That's all that is. All right? And I'm not gonna say, well, I'm woke in response. But that's what they're doing. So that fighting Islamophobia, absolutely, it's just part of being American, a real American in a good way. All right. If I haven't heard from somebody, is there anybody I haven't heard from?
Yeah.
Or are we out of time?
Just one quick thing. We have 10 minutes, so
Okay.
one room for one more question.
Yeah, very, very quickly. If in Vail, that artist, Palestinian artist or Native American artist drew some solidarity art with Palestine, and the city came down hard on her, right? But she took the ACLU and sued, right? The concessions.
Can you tell us what happened? I'm not familiar with that particular incident.
I only know a little bit about it, so maybe somebody else knows, but the concessions were incredible. So I want to speak to those, because one of the things that they were able to do is have like a forum, getting Palestinians and Zionists together, or something. I think that's part of the concessions.
Yeah, to summarize for Rob or for anyone else who's not familiar, this was a woman, an indigenous artist, this was mentioned before. I believe, and forgive me if I'm getting any of this wrong, she had a contract open with Vail to have a whole gallery there. When they had learned that she had made some art explicitly in solidarity with Palestinians from Gaza, they canceled her residency. And through the ACLU, she managed to sue, and I think as of just the last week or the last 2 weeks, she had a result. And I can't say I'm the most familiar on all these concessions that were made, but I will say, after my time negotiating in the encampment, these sorts of kind of community building measures, in terms of like bringing people together, having hard conversations, they can be a really powerful tool. They can also be a distraction. We were offered in the encampment, they said about 3 days in, we will donate $15,000-$20,000 to the Israeli Red Cross. And we will start to hold dialogues between Palestinian students and Jewish students. And in that case, we said, no, you divest is what you're gonna do. But then at the same time, later on, when I was in negotiations, at one point, someone's looking at me from the other end of the table and says, I don't understand why you can't just be accommodating to their ideas. And I said, okay, let's create a Jewish studies department and a Palestinian studies department. And they said, okay. This, for other reasons, later did not come to fruition. But I think the point is here that in any sort of resolution, I think you get to a problem like this. And I think it's a tremendous victory in of itself that this is an indigenous woman seeing the connection to genocide and settler colonialism on our own land and saying, look, it's happening again over there, you better do something. The fact that that is defended as a tenable position, even among, mainstream politics, I think that's a huge win. I think that in itself, for indigenous people alone, is something huge. For Palestinians, something huge as well. But whenever these sorts of community dialogues are proposed, I think it's really important that we ground anything that we do there in the mandate that we have from Palestinians, which they are asking us to use our positionality as Americans, as citizens, to speak their message in places that they can't reach. And I think it's really important to not get too lost in the weeds with that and make sure that we know that if any of these sorts of panels are going to be occurring, that they are working towards meaningful change. I'm not opposed to attending these sorts of things. I think they can actually be really powerful and really important.
C. Walker was her name. C as in vision, C. Walker. You can look it up. It was very easy.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right,
Thanks. I've been in the movement the last 61 years. It was Fannie Lou Hamer that brought me into the movement, and Stokely Carmichael.
Incredible.
But anyway, I wanted to address foundational. Moses Maimonides, I pronounce it wrong, but he was from Grenada, I think, Arabic Spain, and got a lot of the Jewish stuff started there. I think the Hadith started there, and it was amazing. But he went to the Middle East, and I think he went to Khazaria. And what happened was the Muslims and the Christians, the Franks then, were all killing each other off. And so in Khazaria, they decided we don't want Christians or Muslims, and they invited Jewish people who were escaping from Palestine, from the Franks, to go to Khazaria, and they adopted Jewish culture as the culture in Khazaria, which was a Turkish country. And so they were the strongest nation in Central Asia at that time. When Genghis Khan came through, all of the others, he said, you can just pay tribute and you're okay, because he could take over Russia and Kazakhstan and whatever, and Turkey. But Khazaria was strong, so he had to destroy Khazaria. So that's where the Ashkenazi went into Russia and Poland and Germany. They went into Europe from Khazaria, escaping from Genghis Khan. And Germany was the most liberal, the most educated, the most scientific, and the most philosophical of all of the European countries. And then, and Hitler had 5 Jewish friends when he was in Vienna. And then he decided, all right, I want to take power. What you do, you find a target and you aim everything at the target. And he created the target of the Jews. And Martin Buber, who wrote the best understanding of Lenin that I've ever read, and he got a letter from Gandhi one time, I think in '38, and Gandhi said, why don't you do like we do in India, come out and demonstrate.
Could you finish up?
Yeah, 10 seconds. Come out and demonstrate. And Martin Buber wrote back to Gandhi one sentence. He said, Adolf Hitler is not the British Raj. We're dealing with that in this country right now. Donald Trump is not an American democratic person. He has modeled himself after Hitler. That's what we're dealing with.
All right, well, thank you. Look, I thank you all. Really appreciate having a chance to be in dialogue with you. Hope you learned something. Let's keep up our struggle against all forms of discrimination.
I'm giving a talk on the Constitution.
We really appreciate all of you joining us here for this event, and particularly Isa, Rob, and Alex for their wonderful discussion. So thank you again, and look out for future events, because we will continue these teach-in series on different topics in the coming months. So thank you very much. Yeah, and please remember, I mean, all the merchandise out there is to support families in Gaza. So please contribute whatever you can.